Hello, and welcome to the Refugee Welcome Collective Lunch and Learn series. In these sessions, we aim to bring interesting and timely information to you, supporters of refugees. Whether you're a volunteer, a community sponsor, resettlement agency staff, a local advocate, or just someone who's interested in learning more, we do hope that you enjoyed today's session, welcoming LGBTQIA plus refugees. My name is Jessica Ashcraft. I'm with Refugee Welcome Collective. RWC collaborates with partners to provide in-depth training programs, weekly learning sessions, resources, and on-demand technical assistance for sponsors, as well as practitioners at resettlement agencies, refugees who are paired with sponsors, community and institutional partners, and to support quality community sponsorship programs across the United States. Just a little bit of housekeeping as a reminder for everyone joining the call today. There is a control panel in your upper right-hand corner that will allow you to submit questions through the questions box. There's going to be ample time at the end of the webinar for Q&A. You're welcome to put your questions in there as early as you like. Everyone on today's webinar is automatically muted. However, if you do have any technical issues, please raise your hand through the control panel or submit a question via the questions box, and we can try to assist you with that. Additionally, this presentation, any resources, and a recording will be sent to everyone following today's webinar. And this brings us to our presenter for today. I'd like to introduce Paige McLean. Paige is the Program Officer for Complementary Pathways Canada for Rainbow Railroad. Welcome, Paige.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Jessica. I will just wait until I can see my slides and then I'll get started, but I'm so glad to get to chat with you folks today about welcoming LGBTQI plus refugees.
Yes, we're excited to have you.
Amazing, they're there. Okay, hi. So as Jessica mentioned, I am Rainbow Railroad's Program Officer focused on complementary pathways to Canada. More specifically though, what that kind of means is that I am our caseworker and I'm focused on our private sponsorship of refugees program. Before I get into my presentation, I just wanted to do a land acknowledgement. So I just wanted to acknowledge that I am meeting you all on the traditional territory of many First Nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Wendat peoples, and it is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people here in Toronto. And I believe my next slide is my overview slide. Amazing. So I just thought I'd give a bit of an overview of what I'll be talking about today. So I'm going to begin with a bit of an LGBTQI plus 101 for folks who might not be familiar with supporting LGBTQI refugees specifically. I'm then going to talk about Rainbow Railroad's work and my positionality and my work more specifically. I'm then, given that it is the focus of my work, I'm going to talk about some pre-arrival challenges, namely as they relate to Kenya and Turkey, and why those countries specifically, again, I'll get to. And then I'm going to move into a discussion around post-arrival challenges. These are namely strains on resources in times of high cost of living as well. I'll then talk about some strategies for mitigating these challenges, and I'll just close on engagement with Rainbow Railroad. So the acronym LGBTQI plus 101, I just wanted to break this down again a bit for folks who maybe haven't supported queer refugees specifically. L refers to lesbian, so a woman who's attracted to women. Gay means typically a man who's attracted to men. Bisexual is anyone who is attracted to folks of either gender. Transgender referring to a gender identity that doesn't align with someone's sex assigned at birth. Q meaning queer. I kind of use this throughout as an umbrella term as well, sort of interchangeably with LGBTQI+. but it's just a term that can encompass anyone with an LGBTQI plus identity. Intersex, meaning people who are born with differences in their sex traits and reproductive anatomy that are different from the typical kind of what we would call binary of male and female. And then the plus is just referring to all other queer identities. I would say though, just please be mindful when using the word queer, as it can be triggering to some. It has historically been used to kind of marginalize the LGBTQI plus community. In the space of my work and as a LGBTQI plus person myself, do use the term, but I'm just cautious who I use it around. So just a note on that. And lastly, I would just encourage you folks to Google if you have any follow-up questions, or there's a Q&A at the end of this, of course, but about any terms that you might not be familiar with. If you do a search for the Human Rights Campaign glossary, that's a really fantastic LGBT-led and specific resource that might be able to answer any questions that you have there. And next slide, thank you. So now talking a bit about Rainbow Railroad. So we are a not-for-profit aimed at supporting LGBTQI plus people across the world. We work in multiple regions to help LGBTQI plus people who, due to their gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation, or sex characteristics, face oppression and persecution at the hands of their government and the public as well. We are a registered charity in both the US and Canada, but our headquarters is located in Toronto. We offer an entire suite of programs in order to best support LGBTQI plus people on their journeys to safety. And our main bread and butter program is our emergency travel support program. And through this program last year, we were able to relocate 400 LGBTQI plus people to safer countries in 2022. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I wanted to talk a bit about my positionality as well. I am part of the LGBTQI plus community, but I am a white cisgender Canadian-born settler. So I do have lived experience as a queer person, but not as a refugee. I already mentioned my title, but more specifically, it's my focus is our private sponsorship of refugees program, which sees arrivals in Toronto specifically. And just a note, most of the support that I provide is pre-arrival and not post-arrival, which sounds like it might be different experience to folks here on the call. But that's okay. We can learn from each other, and I'll mostly be talking about those pre-arrival challenges as well. Yeah, next slide, thank you. So I wanted to talk a bit about pre-arrival challenges generally. So there are, of course, situations and conditions in various countries that affect all people. So examples of these would be like widespread violence, wars. We're now seeing an influx of climate refugees, different situations like that can impact everybody. But then I, of course, wanted to talk about situations and conditions that are specific to LGBTQI plus people. So these are persecution, family rejection, folks either choosing to come out or being outed in the community or in media, and then facing persecution based on that. And then of those eligible for the private sponsorship of refugees program under the Canadian government, we most commonly see Iranians and Ugandans seeking asylum. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about why. So, and how it relates to the queer community specifically. So Iranians are one of our highest groups because it is permitted by law in Iran to, and I'm just going to quote this directly, families may kill, physically harm, or force their members into arranged marriages with the intent to protect or defend the honor or reputation of the family and or the community. So as I'm sure you can imagine, a lot of LGBTQI plus people in Iran are potentially facing those major risks. And so they flee to a neighboring country. That country is typically Turkey, which I'll talk more about later. But I also wanted to talk about one of the other highest requests for help countries for folks that are eligible for private sponsorship of refugees, which is Uganda. So in Uganda, the Penal Code Act has sections on what they refer to as unnatural offenses or indecent practices, and these are often interpreted to criminalize homosexuality or gender expression. And additionally, the Sexual Offences Bill by the Ugandan Parliament, which passed in 2019, explicitly criminalizes same-sex relationships. And then the third piece that I just wanted to touch on, of course, given what's going on in Uganda right now, is the Anti-Homosexuality Bill of 2023. And that was signed into law on May 26th, so just a couple of weeks ago. So that doesn't speak to our historic data really, of course, but we have noticed like a huge influx of requests for help of either individuals who are in Uganda or who have fled to a neighboring country. Next slide, please. Thank you. So for the pre-arrival challenges, specifically as they relate to Kenya, so the majority of refugees that in Kenya that Rainbow Railroad supports are in Kakuma refugee camp. You might have heard of the name of this camp before in the context of LGBTQI plus refugees. But yeah, so there's a specific section in that camp that is kind of allocated to LGBTQI plus refugees specifically. And so unfortunately, what ends up happening is that rather than that providing a level of protection, it just kind of honestly creates a vulnerability, which is really unfortunate for those folks. So anybody who's homophobic or transphobic just like knows where they are, right? If there was adequate security there, that would be great, but there unfortunately isn't. And so kind of for more information on that, I would encourage folks to read the report that Rainbow Railroad did with an organization called ORAM, which is the Organization for Refuge, Asylum, and Migration. The report is available on our website. But yeah, there's lots of really unfortunate but useful kind of statistics and information about what the LGBTQI plus refugees in Kakuma are experiencing. And then just a final point that I wanted to highlight, there's been challenges in securing exit permits for folks that are in Kenya that I've noticed over the past probably year in my work, which is really unfortunate and frustrating because we can do all the advocacy points on an individual's case and get the case moving and get an interview done and get a decision made. Excuse me. But if they don't have that exit permit, they can't leave. And so it's just been really frustrating. So I just wanted to highlight that as well. And next slide, thank you. So the next country that I mentioned, so we normally see Ugandans fleeing to Kenya, and then we see Iranians fleeing to Turkey are kind of the two top groups that we see based on our requests for help that are eligible for the private sponsorship of refugees program. So in terms of the Iranians fleeing to Turkey, Turkey has a very large refugee population, which encompasses about 4 million refugees and the largest refugee hosting country in the world for the past 8 years. So the attitude of people in Turkey towards refugees has changed from kind of like a kinder hospitable approach to that more so of hostility, unfortunately. And over the past maybe 6 months in my work, I've noticed a trend of individuals being able or being unable rather to get either refugee identity documents or they are unable to renew expired documents, which can sound like maybe a smaller issue, but it's been causing a wider range of kind of broader issues, which is including not being able to access affordable medical care or inability to access housing at all. And even it's been causing as well among folks that I work with, even a deportation risk, right? Ultimately, you know, if somebody doesn't have that kind of piece of paper proving that they're able to be somewhere, that, yeah, it puts them at really great risk. So, yeah, those are kind of the overall challenges that I see in my day-to-day work, just among those two kind of broader populations. And if we can open the next slide, I'll continue with the challenges, unfortunately, by talking about challenges in the host country, so here in Canada. So, of course, many folks do well here in Canada and in Toronto. There's a huge, very positive shift in, you know, the transition between being persecuted by law and being protected by law, right? That does have a huge, profound impact on these folks and their lives. But it's also not all, you know, no pun intended, because we're talking about queer refugees, but it's not all sunshine and rainbows here. There are challenges here, of course, and the biggest kind of overarching one is rising costs of living. So right now, Rainbow Railroad, through the private sponsorship of refugees program in Canada, I'll talk about the US in a bit, but we can currently only relocate folks to Toronto, which it's one of the highest costs of living in Canada. And yeah, it's a huge burden that impacts the day-to-day for sure. And similarly around housing, low-cost housing in Toronto is very difficult to find, particularly like at the beginning of the arrival process. And not just low-cost housing, but low-cost housing that's, you know, safe and clean is a really big challenge. And the other one I wanted to talk about was language barriers. So interpretation services are available, but often hard to come by for free or low cost. And yeah, like this sort of goes to the theme that I spoke to in when I was doing the kind of introduction and overview of what I was going to be talking about. Which is the fact that there are often pretty significant strains on free or low cost resources, and which takes us into a segue on mental health, which is pretty much the same thing, where services are available here, but they're hard to come by for free or for an affordable cost. And just because those resources are so incredibly strained here. And just in particular, I wanted to just mention mental health resources that are culturally relevant and like non-Westernized are incredibly important for newcomers. And yet, yeah, they're just very strained, unfortunately. And if we could get the next slide, please. I'm going to talk about some strategies for mitigating challenges. I unfortunately don't have a whole lot here because I can't, you know, rewrite Ugandan law or fix the Toronto housing crisis, and neither can anyone on this call. We can, of course, do our best advocacy, but again, ultimately, the majority of us don't have that kind of power. So these are just some strategies that I've either found useful in my day-to-day work or have heard from volunteers that have been useful, or any of my, you know, incredible colleagues that do this work as well. These are just some things that we've noticed. So in terms of pre-arrival support, just given the distance, unfortunately, there's less that we can do, but we can certainly try to leverage organizations on the ground. So some examples would be like if there's mental health support available physically near the individual, that's obviously incredibly useful. Um, Seeing if we can relocate folks into safe houses as opposed to them staying in refugee camps. As long as there's, really good security present, that can be useful. If we have the ability to support folks financially, that of course is huge, but I understand that that's not always possible. And then just maintaining communication. So the example that I always like to use here is our mental health program officer was speaking to an individual who was staying in Turkey, and that individual said to her, right now, like, you're the only LGBTQI plus friendly person that I know, right? And so even if we can't solve everything, just that line for listening can really make a huge impact on an individual pre-arrival. And then post-arrival, and these also apply to pre-arrival a bit as well, but maybe not as much as we're trying to support somebody in, integrating into life in a new country, is just asking the person questions and being curious and non-assumptive. So for example, if an individual is like trying to find housing, but they're really frustrated and not able to find anything, maybe rather than making assumptions about kind of where they might be looking or how the process is going, maybe just asking them, I'll use an example here from my work about well, where have you been looking, and have you been looking at shared spaces? And maybe that individual, for example, has only been looking at condos because they really want to live alone. And so that's where we can kind of jump in and say, well, unfortunately, given the high costs of living, it's very likely that you'll be unable to live alone. And so let's look at these queer specific vetted Facebook groups where yeah, you're not going to be living alone, but you'll at least be able to live with other folks that identify similarly to you, and you know, who get it, who understand what being queer is like. Mistakes are okay. The biggest example that I can think of here is misgendering someone. It happens. Just apologize and move on and do your best to not do it again. And that's all we can do, right? So just a lot of us are new at this. We're all going to make mistakes. It's okay to just acknowledge and say, just kind of say to yourself, oh, sucks that I did that, and then just move on. We're all learning and growing as people. So yeah, and then this next point kind of speaks, like, already was kind of covered by the housing example that I gave, but providing guidance and direction while respecting agency is kind of having that tough conversation of, look, I know you really wanted to live alone, but that's just like, let's look at your budget and just kind of explain, like, you have this much per month, and even in a shared living situation, it's still going to be tight with that budget, right? So living on your own, like, I hate to say it, but just really isn't going to be possible. And so you're still respecting what that person wants, but you're providing the guidance that you have based on your experience living in my case, it's Toronto, but in your folks' case, it's in the US. So yeah, you're providing guidance and supporting them, but you're still respecting kind of their wish as much as you can. And then maintaining an intersectional approach. So for folks who might not be familiar with this, an intersectional approach acknowledges multiple identities that someone might have. So if someone, for example, like, let's say you're welcoming a trans Ugandan who fled to Kenya. So you there then could be acknowledging, for example, their racial background, their sexual orientation, their gender identity, if they have any disabilities, for example. It's just about seeing the whole person, for example, and not just seeing them as a refugee or not just seeing them as a queer person. It's about seeing their entire background. And one example of this that I think of is folks might think that they're, employing a really great intersectional approach and just providing like the best possible support by, for example, maybe connecting that newcomer to like a community of queer Kenyans or queer Ugandans. That could sound really great to you and to the other volunteers, for example, but ultimately, again, going to the first point, asking questions. If you maybe don't ask that person about what they want, it turns out that that could potentially be very re-traumatizing for that person to be in touch with that community because of their past experiences with maybe Kenyans specifically or Ugandans or whatever it might be. For example, even if they're queer identified, it might not acknowledge their situation before coming to, again, in your case, it's the US. So again, just being mindful of the fact that, yeah, just asking before you maybe encourage the person to kind of join that opportunity about what might be more useful and supportive for them. And next slide, please. So I just wanted to wrap up before we get to questions on how to engage with Rainbow Railroad if you're excited about our work. I'm also happy to answer any other questions about it, of course. But the first and I would say most important thing that you can do is to just support our work. The best way to do this is to share our social media posts and particularly sharing posts that highlight the work of activists or organizations globally. So for example, given the current situation in Uganda with the passing of that anti-homosexuality bill just a couple of weeks ago, there's many, but there's one really great organization on the ground called Sexual Minorities of Uganda. If you're so inclined, I would really encourage you to kind of amplify their work in any way that you can. And of course, donations, funds do go directly to LGBTQI plus relocation and support. However, we're able to support folks, we do our best, and that's just similar to social media or just through our website would be how you could find out how to do that. And then volunteering. So we need two categories of volunteers to really power our work. General volunteering through like translation or support at events or anything like that. And then also the opportunity, depending on your folks' background, you may already be familiar with, is volunteering to be on a Rainbow Railroad settlement team. So we currently have opportunities in 4 cities. So those are Toronto, Chicago, San Francisco, and DC. On our website under sponsor a case, you'll see 2 different links. One's for Canadian sponsorship and one's for US. So if you're interested, please fill in the form that's most appropriate. And lastly, just stay tuned. We have a big announcement on June 8th. So just stay tuned to our social media for that. I can't say what it is right now, but that's the day of our big fundraiser here in Toronto, and we have a really exciting day ahead on the 8th. So stay tuned for that, please. And yeah, next slide. Just in closing, there is a Q&A period coming up. But I just wanted to say thank you all so much for your time and for your attention. And just if there's anything else that I can answer, do let me know. And after this webinar, if something comes up or if you have a question, there was, I don't think I see it, but that's okay. There was an email address on this screen. That might have been my fault. That's privatesponsorship@rainbowrailroad.org. Myself and a few colleagues respond to that email address, and we'd be happy to follow up with anything that was talked about today.
Thank you so much, Paige, and we can definitely include your email in follow-up communications. Really appreciate the wide range that you provided. I think that going from some historical and political context to the pre-arrival to the post-arrival gives people a really nice snapshot. So certainly appreciate you taking the time to walk us through that. We're going to, as Paige said, begin the Q&A portion. And so as a reminder, questions should go in that control panel in the right in the questions box. So go ahead and start populating those now. While people are doing that, I have kind of a general question. You shouted out some really great resources I was taking note of myself, but just as a general question I think would be helpful for anyone out there. What are resources that are out there for welcomers to educate themselves on some of those, especially intersectional considerations? People who may have some experience or interest in working with refugees, but really need a little bit more guidance and support around looking at things through an intersectional lens and going ahead and educating themselves on this population.
Sure. So it's a little bit tough for me to answer because, again, I'm mindful of the fact that I'm in Toronto and that other folks on this call are in the US. But in Toronto, there's a really, really great organization called the 519. It's our kind of LGBT all-encompassing welcome center. Um, they are really, really great. And then in the US, I know that the Welcome Corps program, which is the private sponsorship of refugees program, that's kind of, not to brag, but kind of being copied from the Canadian model and transferred into the US. Um, they, I'm sure, would have some great resources on their website as well. And then I would also recommend the Human Rights Campaign website, or if you just Google HRC. Um, for context and for clarity, I maybe I really didn't get into our more official mandate, but Rainbow Railroad's mandate is to kind of like help people. I always say get from A to B, so get from that unsafe country and to the safe country, and then we refer them to other resources elsewhere. So I would love to say, like, go to our website, it's full of resources, but ultimately we recognize that there's a lack of organizations that are specifically helping to relocate folks. So what we do is we facilitate that relocation, and then we refer them to those other organizations that I've mentioned. So like here in Toronto, it would be the 519. For example, to make sure that they get that kind of post-arrival support, either to the 519 or to volunteers. And so that's where you folks come in if you're interested.
Yeah, I appreciate that. We do have a question in the chat. How has resettlement in the US been going so far? I'm assuming this question refers to, and you might not have insight on this, but if you can share, you mentioned that your organization works both in the US and in Canada. And so if you do have a little bit of insight to share what kind of work is being done in the US through Rainbow Railroad and what that process looks like for newcomers when they interact with your organization.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think of two different programs when we talk about that in terms of the US. So the first one that I think of is the private sponsorship of refugees program, which is very new. And we actually, Rainbow Railroad, haven't seen any arrivals through that program yet. So I can't really give you an answer on private sponsorship in the US specifically. What I can speak to though is our emergency travel support program that I mentioned that we relocated about 400 individuals through last year. Most of those folks were relocated to Canada, specifically through our government assisted refugees partnership with the Canadian government, kind of a special project for Afghans. And then also just given ways that people can travel and just general migration movement. A lot of those folks through that emergency travel support program do end up in Europe, but some do end up in the US. I'm sorry, I get talking about our programming and I get excited, so I got distracted. But in the
I
US
love it.
specifically, we have seen some arrivals into the US. And it's been, I mean, it's challenging. You know, there's, especially in the US right now, there's a pretty large anti-trans rhetoric going on, and not just rhetoric, a lot of bills and legislation being passed as well. And so it's been challenging, but fortunately what I am seeing through, as we haven't seen arrivals, but as we develop and work through this US private sponsorship model, we're seeing a lot of really great organizations willing to partner with us and really, really, really excited to get this program moving. And so there is help and there is support out there, but it's kind of similar to Canada, honestly, in that there is support available. But that doesn't mean that resettlement doesn't come without its challenges as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. We have another question in the chat. It says, do you know in your work on, this will be a little complicated because it's asylum seeker. So a page is in Canada, so this might be different. And you can answer one way or the other, but have you heard of, I guess, LGBT asylum seekers that are deported? I'm going to assume this question is actually referring to deported back to Turkey due to administration issues, policy issues on our side of things, like working without a permit or absence of regular attendance signatures, things like that. So have you had those cases come through, I think is the question.
Um, I haven't really seen those. I'm gonna start just before I forget. Email that private sponsorship email account. I have a colleague who is very, very well versed in this. I just am not, so I'd be happy to put
Sure.
you in touch with that individual. But I mean, yeah, it does unfortunately happen where when folks arrive and are then making a refugee claim, they can then be sent back. And that's, I mean, you've cited administrative issues, but it's also just how problematic the asylum claim process is. For a bit of context as to kind of why I have less of an answer, and I apologize, I don't have one, but the private sponsorship of refugees program, how it's structured is that all of that kind of interviewing, medical exam, all of those pieces are done overseas, for example. And then when the folks do arrive, they arrive with what's called in Canada a permanent resident status. I believe there's a similar structure in the US, and that the US private sponsorship model is going to be structured similarly. Like they're not going to be arriving here and then making that asylum claim where they are potentially sent back. So apologies if that helps kind of clarify why I have a bit less of an answer, but email that private sponsorship at rainbowrailroad.org email address and I'll have a colleague of mine get back to you.
Yeah, thank you for that. And it's no worries. You don't have to have all of the answers. These policies also are constantly shifting, so this is making it an additional, for sure, challenge to answer as well. Let me check. We have one last one, I believe, in the chat. This question says, it's a little bit lengthy. One moment, please. Yeah, okay. It says, I am an LGBTQIA plus asylum seeker in Turkey. Since the newly elected coalition government in Turkey campaigned to close LGBTQIA plus organizations and demonized LGBTQ plus individuals, do you have any emergency programs or organizations for refugees in Turkey? Last week, the government canceled a student event, for example. So what resources are available for individuals in Turkey that you might be aware of who are experiencing this oppression currently?
Yeah, of course. I just want to start by acknowledging your situation. Thank you for sharing that. That's it takes a lot of vulnerability to just like kind of share all of that with us. And so I just wanted to start by acknowledging that. So like Rainbow Railroad doesn't have anything like that specifically in Turkey. We're kind of like operating in Canada and then helping folks reach safety to other countries. But what I can encourage you to do is if you wish to leave Turkey, you can fill in the request for help form on our website. It's just rainbowrailroad.org/get help. And right when you enter rainbowrailroad.org as well, there's a pop-up with the form linked as well. And in addition, there are a couple of really great resources in Turkey as well. There's one called the Aman Project that I believe, if it's reopened, offers a shelter if that's something that you need. There's also an organization called Positive SM that supports LGBTQIA plus people in Turkey. There are a handful of organizations, and yeah, you are welcome to email private sponsorship at rainbowrailroad.org as well. And I can send you like a list with some contact information as well, if that would be useful.
Yeah, appreciate that. And we'll do one more from the chat. I think there's one more that got in there. I want to try to get to everyone's. This question is, how do we best manage expectations? I found in my minimal experience that when refugees arrive, they've been thinking often about life in the US or in Canada for a very long time, and maybe specifically, how do we manage expectations LGBTQ plus individuals might have, especially if those expectations are not met? And I'm guessing this question might be around that promise of potential protection with the law, from, or yeah, protection from the law, I guess in their case. Yeah, so how do we manage those?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really great question, and definitely comes up almost on a daily basis in the folks that do arrive in Canada or the US, that I or the volunteers that we support work with. Um, it's huge, and I mean, um, going back to what I said about some of the strategies, it can be helpful to first dissect maybe where some of those expectations are coming from, right? It might be that they're talking to a certain friend who had a much different experience from theirs in resettlement for whatever reason. It could be even, for example, they're arriving without qualifications that necessarily meet Canada's or the US's rather standards, and so they see this one person that had a really great experience and was hired into a well-paying job very quickly, and all of these different things that just had different volunteer support, like just really worked out really well for them. And then you might be working with somebody who's not having that experience. So I would say just, and not even frame it like a question period, but just have a conversation with them about the root of those expectations, where those expectations are coming from. And then that might help you to then kind of position or redirect the conversation around well, unfortunately, that's my cat, sorry. Unfortunately, like this is where things are a lot different than years ago when this person arrived. The cost of like inflation is much higher, and so unfortunately you have less budget than that person did, or you don't have the educational kind of background that that person had, and so unfortunately it's going to be harder for you for the first little while. Just really like diving into where the expectations come from, I think is helpful, to then kind of inform your response to them and kind of do your best to maybe steer them towards whatever it might be, like more affordable options, for example. But then also ultimately, as hard as it is to maybe just watch somebody kind of make choices that you might not think are best for them, still just positioning the fact that they're adults and that they have their own agency, and that even though you might not necessarily like agree with the decision they're making, they they think that they're making the best decision for themselves, right? And maybe they are ultimately. And so just doing your best to kind of dissect where those expectations are coming from, while still kind of respecting their individual needs.
Yeah, I think that's a great response. Thank you for that. Um, we, okay, we have one more. I want to get to everyone, so I will ask this last one and then we'll have some closing remarks. So this question is from someone who works with IRC at a local resettlement agency in Atlanta. And of course, most of their clients come through sort of the formal US RAP, United States Department of Reception and Placement program, as most refugees in the US do. So the question is, does your organization ever get requests for any kind of assistance from clients, from newcomers, refugees that are coming through that US RAP program and are like already here, maybe working with an agency on the ground?
Mhm. Yeah, definitely. We do get requests for help for folks who are in what we refer to as safe countries. So it could be, sorry, like Canada, the US, Europe, anywhere or anywhere like that. And so then what we would just simply do is kind of respond to that person, clarifying what our role is and clarifying our mandate, and then saying we would encourage you to reach out to these organizations. And so we would then have a list of organizations in Canada, the US,
Mhm.
or those safer European countries, for example.
Yeah,
Um,
that's wonderful. And could a resettlement agency here in the US request those resources to be able to provide themselves at the office as well?
sorry, just to clarify, to request
Mhm.
those organizations from us.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so I would encourage people just to do their own research, only because we we can respond to those requests, but
Mhm.
ultimately, like, we're probably just going to be doing the same research that folks would be able to do
Fair.
independently.
Mhm.
As we get this US private sponsorship program kind of more up and running,
Yeah.
I'm sure we can make those resources a little more readily available, but for now we are just kind of figuring those out alongside with you folks until we're
Yeah.
able to relocate more folks to the United States.
Yeah. Appreciate that. Um, and okay, so I'm gonna move to our final question and then we'll kind of wrap up, which is just to give you the opportunity if there's anything that you didn't get to say that you would love to leave our audience with, any thoughts that you might have or parting sentiments.
Sure. So, as a caseworker who focuses on our private sponsorship of refugees program, I just want to highlight the necessity for volunteers, particularly in the US right now, given that this program is just kind of being lifted off the ground. So, if you're in one of those three cities in the US, Chicago, San Francisco, or DC, I would highly, highly recommend that you look at our website and the Welcome Corps website as well, and kind of research the program. Ask any questions you have to that private sponsorship at rainbowrailroad.org inboxes, or inbox rather. It's it's not like a cute kind of corny thing for me to say that this program can't function without our volunteers, because it literally cannot.
Mhm.
Um, and so we just really want to encourage you folks, if you feel so inclined and like you can commit to it, to sign up through our website. It's just rainbowrailroad.org. And then down at sponsor a case, you'll then see the Canadian or the US forms. We would just really, really encourage you folks to sign up if you feel like you could support an LGBTQI plus newcomer.
Yeah, thank you. No, that's not, that's an important sentiment to end on. And I think so many of us in this work feel that way about our supporters and our volunteers. Could not do it without them. Well, thank you so much again, Paige, and thank you to everyone who has attended today's RWC Lunch and Learn. We would love to hear from you, receive any feedback on both today's Lunch and Learn and also hear your suggestions for future Lunch and Learn topics. We would like for you, if you're able, to take a moment now to complete a survey. You can use your phone to follow the QR code on the screen, or you can follow a link that will be provided in the chat. We look forward to hearing from you. You will receive a follow-up email with a link to view the recording of today's webinar. You may disseminate that to, if you're an affiliate, some of your supporters, or if you yourself are a supporter, maybe some of your friends that might be interested in learning more and volunteering, as Paige said. And on behalf of Refugee Welcome Collective, again, thank you so much for joining us today, and happy Pride Month.